Chapter 1. The Invisible Healer. The scent of pine needles and warm blood was a familiar mix to Aelia, a strange comfort in the silent forested edges of the northern packlands. Her fingers, nimble and stained with berry juice used for tinctures, moved with careful expertise over the lacerated flank of a young wolf. She wanted to matter, truly matter, but the ambition felt like a borrowed coat, too large and too conspicuous for the pack's designated spare daughter. Her twin, Serene, was the gilded reflection, standing on a sun-drenched platform in the clearing, accepting the Alpha's ceremonial praise for diplomatic ease. Aelia always observed from the periphery, her heart holding a familiar ache, the fear that her deepest self was simply invisible, unworthy of anything more than mending the discarded. This persistent self-doubt, a quiet parasite, was the reason she never pressed for acknowledgement. She was certain any true spotlight would only illuminate her flaws. A sudden jarring sound sliced through the forest's quiet rhythm. The deep resonating blast of a ram's horn, usually reserved for coronations or declarations of war. Because the Alpha's face immediately paled, the atmosphere instantly shifted from festive pride to brittle panic. A heavily armored courier, streaked with road dust, stumbled into the clearing, clutching a sealed scroll embossed with the terrifying crest of the Alpha King Alastair. What new decree of devastation could that paper hold? The scroll was immediately presented, and its contents were swiftly and disastrously revealed. The Alpha King demanded a marriage alliance. He required the most prominent daughter of their bloodline. He was calling for Serene. Conversely, Serene's reaction was immediate and theatrical. A sharp, decisive refusal that echoed her inherent selfishness. She would not be sacrificed to a distant legendary ruler known only for his power and chilling ruthlessness. Aelia, still kneeling beside the wounded wolf, felt a cold knot twist in her stomach. Then, her father's gaze landed on her, and the fear became a prophecy. She was offered in her sister's place. A wave of light-headedness washed over her, making the forest floor seem suddenly unsteady. The world was tilting. This was the moment everything shattered. Chapter 2. The Hesitation and the Promise. Furthermore, the air in her small, sparsely furnished room felt impossibly heavy, thick with the unsaid obligations and the faint, coppery scent of guilt. She paced the polished floorboards, her mind a frantic, desperate tangle. She debated the impossible choice: freedom, the quiet, safe life she secretly craved, or duty, the terrifying journey to a brutal king. Her reflection in the dull windowpane stared back, highlighting the exhaustion beneath her eyes, the portrait of a woman who fully expected to be humiliated and discarded the moment she stepped into the spotlight. She hoped, desperately, to decline, to melt back into the shadows of the apothecary, but the sense of obligation to her family, to the pack, was a crushing weight. How could she choose herself when the entire pack's safety rested on this alliance? This internal conflict between desire for freedom and reluctant courage was a slow, agonizing poison. Imagine the silence of a deep cave, cold and dark, suddenly pierced by a single flickering flame. That small flame was a sudden thought. Maybe, just maybe, by performing this monumental act of service, she could finally earn a sliver of worthiness in her own eyes. Because accepting this fate meant accepting the very humiliation she feared, she sought to frame it as a necessary penance, a final grand self-sacrifice. Her father entered the room, his face lined with genuine regret. He offered a surprisingly tender apology, because he understood the fear radiating from her, fear of a destiny that wasn't hers. "You are doing this for us, Aelia," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I will never forget this." Yet, his words offered little comfort against the terror of facing the Alpha King. As a small, unexpected open loop, a tiny worn leather pouch, was pressed into her hand, he told her it held something only she would understand, a family secret she must guard. She slipped the small item into the deep pocket of the gown, feeling the hard outline of something unfamiliar. She had to go. She boarded the carriage, the luxurious velvet seat feeling like cold stone. The world she knew receded into a blur of green and gray, leaving her utterly alone with her dread and the silent, unspoken promise. Would this forced alliance save her pack, or merely condemn her? The rattling wheels carried her toward an unimaginable future. Chapter 3. The Scintillation of Destiny. Upon the cessation of the relentless journey, the air around King Alastair's palace felt different. Sharper, electric, heavy with latent power and the faint metallic scent of ozone. The palace itself was less a dwelling and more a towering fortress of black basalt, its crenellations cutting aggressive silhouettes against a bruised evening sky. Aelia's apprehension intensified to a buzzing static beneath her skin as she stepped from the carriage, the sheer grandeur and intimidating aura of the place threatening to swallow her whole. She wore her sister's ridiculously long, heavily embroidered gown, a shimmering cascade of blue silk, and as she was ushered toward the throne room, the borrowed material proved her undoing. Her foot caught the hem, and she stumbled hard, catching herself only at the last, humiliating instant. The moment was an agonizing spectacle, a clear indication of her unsuitability. The enormous throne room, lit by towering silver candelabras, was immediately silent. The court, a sea of perfectly tailored, predatory faces, held its breath. Aelia, desperate to regain her footing, lifted her chin and focused on the man seated at the apex of the room. Alastair. He was larger than legend described, a shadow of coiled tension and raw, elemental strength. His silver crown was merely an accessory. His power was the true regalia. He looked less like a king and more like a barely contained storm. He was the terrifying finality of their world. She wanted to shrink, to vanish into the elaborate rug, because his stare was a tangible pressure, a piercing examination that saw straight through the silk and the fear. But then, as their gazes locked for a paralyzing instant, something unexpected twisted the narrative. His wolf-gold eyes flared. It wasn't anger, it was a flash of raw, involuntary heat, like a forge suddenly given a massive infusion of oxygen. The intensity was shocking, a single sharp scintillation of destiny that seemed to vibrate between them. It lasted for a single breathless heartbeat, a subtle primal response that the crowded room failed to register, because only Aelia felt the jolt, a dizzying magnetic pull that defied her logic and shattered her fear, replacing it with a startling, dangerous curiosity. What did that look mean? The scent of him, clean linen and mountain air mixed with something wild, filled her lungs. She didn't trip on the gown again. She lifted her chin higher, a silent challenge blooming in her chest, utterly unprepared for the supernatural entanglement that single gaze had just ignited. The scent of pine needles and warm blood was a familiar mix to Aelia, a strange comfort in the silent forested edges of the northern packlands. Her fingers, nimble and stained with berry juice used for tinctures, moved with careful expertise over the lacerated flank of a young wolf. She wanted to matter, truly matter, but the ambition felt like a borrowed coat, too large and too conspicuous for the pack's designated spare daughter. Her twin, Serene, was the gilded reflection, standing on a sun-drenched platform in the clearing, accepting the Alpha's ceremonial praise for diplomatic ease. Aelia always observed from the periphery, her heart holding a familiar ache, the fear that her deepest self was simply invisible, unworthy of anything more than mending the discarded. This persistent self-doubt, a quiet parasite, was the reason she never pressed for acknowledgement. She was certain any true spotlight would only illuminate her flaws. A sudden jarring sound sliced through the forest's quiet rhythm. The deep resonating blast of a ram's horn, usually reserved for coronations or declarations of war. Because the Alpha's face immediately paled, the atmosphere instantly shifted from festive pride to brittle panic. A heavily armored courier, streaked with road dust, stumbled into the clearing, clutching a sealed scroll embossed with the terrifying crest of the Alpha King Alastair. What new decree of devastation could that paper hold? The scroll was immediately presented, and its contents were swiftly and disastrously revealed. The Alpha King demanded a marriage alliance. He required the most prominent daughter of their bloodline. He was calling for Serene. Conversely, Serene's reaction was immediate and theatrical. A sharp, decisive refusal that echoed her inherent selfishness. She would not be sacrificed to a distant legendary ruler known only for his power and chilling ruthlessness. Aelia, still kneeling beside the wounded wolf, felt a cold knot twist in her stomach. Then, her father's gaze landed on her, and the fear became a prophecy. She was offered in her sister's place. A wave of light-headedness washed over her, making the forest floor seem suddenly unsteady. The world was tilting. This was the moment everything shattered. Furthermore, the air in her small, sparsely furnished room felt impossibly heavy, thick with the unsaid obligations and the faint, coppery scent of guilt. She paced the polished floorboards, her mind a frantic, desperate tangle. She debated the impossible choice: freedom, the quiet, safe life she secretly craved, or duty, the terrifying journey to a brutal king. Her reflection in the dull windowpane stared back, highlighting the exhaustion beneath her eyes, the portrait of a woman who fully expected to be humiliated and discarded the moment she stepped into the spotlight. She hoped, desperately, to decline, to melt back into the shadows of the apothecary, but the sense of obligation to her family, to the pack, was a crushing weight. How could she choose herself when the entire pack's safety rested on this alliance? This internal conflict between desire for freedom and reluctant courage was a slow, agonizing poison. Imagine the silence of a deep cave, cold and dark, suddenly pierced by a single flickering flame. That small flame was a sudden thought. Maybe, just maybe, by performing this monumental act of service, she could finally earn a sliver of worthiness in her own eyes. Because accepting this fate meant accepting the very humiliation she feared, she sought to frame it as a necessary penance, a final grand self-sacrifice. Her father entered the room, his face lined with genuine regret. He offered a surprisingly tender apology, because he understood the fear radiating from her, fear of a destiny that wasn't hers. "You are doing this for us, Aelia," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I will never forget this." Yet, his words offered little comfort against the terror of facing the Alpha King. As a small unexpected open loop, a tiny worn leather pouch, was pressed into her hand, he told her it held something only she would understand, a family secret she must guard. She slipped the small item into the deep pocket of the gown, feeling the hard outline of something unfamiliar. She had to go. She boarded the carriage, the luxurious velvet seat feeling like cold stone. The world she knew receded into a blur of green and gray, leaving her utterly alone with her dread and the silent, unspoken promise. Would this forced alliance save her pack, or merely condemn her? The rattling wheels carried her toward an unimaginable future. Upon the cessation of the relentless journey, the air around King Alastair's palace felt different. Sharper, electric, heavy with latent power and the faint metallic scent of ozone. The palace itself was less a dwelling and more a towering fortress of black basalt, its crenellations cutting aggressive silhouettes against a bruised evening sky. Aelia's apprehension intensified to a buzzing static beneath her skin as she stepped from the carriage, the sheer grandeur and intimidating aura of the place threatening to swallow her whole. She wore her sister's ridiculously long, heavily embroidered gown, a shimmering cascade of blue silk, and as she was ushered toward the throne room, the borrowed material proved her undoing. Her foot caught the hem, and she stumbled hard, catching herself only at the last, humiliating instant. The moment was an agonizing spectacle, a clear indication of her unsuitability. The enormous throne room, lit by towering silver candelabras, was immediately silent. The court, a sea of perfectly tailored, predatory faces, held its breath. Aelia, desperate to regain her footing, lifted her chin and focused on the man seated at the apex of the room. Alastair. He was larger than legend described, a shadow of coiled tension and raw, elemental strength. His silver crown was merely an accessory. His power was the true regalia. He looked less like a king and more like a barely contained storm. He was the terrifying finality of their world. She wanted to shrink, to vanish into the elaborate rug, because his stare was a tangible pressure, a piercing examination that saw straight through the silk and the fear. But then, as their gazes locked for a paralyzing instant, something unexpected twisted the narrative. His wolf-gold eyes flared. It wasn't anger, it was a flash of raw, involuntary heat, like a forge suddenly given a massive infusion of oxygen. The intensity was shocking, a single sharp scintillation of destiny that seemed to vibrate between them. It lasted for a single breathless heartbeat, a subtle primal response that the crowded room failed to register, because only Aelia felt the jolt, a dizzying magnetic pull that defied her logic and shattered her fear, replacing it with a startling, dangerous curiosity. What did that look mean? The scent of him, clean linen and mountain air mixed with something wild, filled her lungs. She didn't trip on the gown again. She lifted her chin higher, a silent challenge blooming in her chest, utterly unprepared for the supernatural entanglement that single gaze had just ignited. Chapter 4. The Unbreakable Thread. The humiliation of her clumsy entry still burned on her cheeks, yet the sheer intensity of the king's fleeting gaze was a distraction, an electric hum beneath the surface of the royal court. As the formal presentation concluded, the surrounding nobles, sleek and venomous as vipers, wasted no time in circling their new prey. In fact, their whispered disdain was loud enough to scrape against the vaulted ceilings. One particularly sneering duchess, all sharp angles and judgmental lace, leaned in close. Such a shame about the unfortunate choice of dress, my dear. Not quite the presence King Alastair requires, is it? Her voice dripped with condescension. Aelia felt the familiar impulse to retreat, to offer a quiet apology for her existence, but the memory of her father's desperate look, because the pack needed this alliance, held her rigid. Just as the Duchess prepared a second more lethal strike, a massive warm presence materialized directly beside Aelia. The ambient temperature of the room seemed to spike. It was Alastair. His proximity was a dizzying sensation, the scent of mountain air and ancient power now overwhelming. He didn't speak to Aelia. His voice, a low tectonic rumble, was directed solely at the Duchess. Duchess Alara, you seem overly concerned with my bride's attire. Are you suggesting an insult to my judgment? His tone wasn't a question. It was a final, chilling decree. The Duchess instantly recoiled, her face draining of color. Moreover, Alastair's large, calloused hand moved with deliberate slowness, settling on the small of Aelia's back. The brief contact was a shockwave. A searing heat flared where their bodies met, traveling straight into Aelia's core. It was unmistakable. The mate bond, the ancient, supernatural thread of destiny, had just awakened, violently and without her consent. Her shock was absolute, fear and dizzying attraction swirling together like storm clouds. Mate. But he was expecting Serene. He's made a mistake. I'm the spare. This open loop, the confusion between her identity and the bond's sudden claim, immediately isolated her within the throng. Alastair's grip tightened imperceptibly, anchoring her. This is my Luna, he announced to the room, the declaration vibrating with dangerous authority. The initial faint rumor of her unsuitability had just been annihilated, replaced by the terrifying, undeniable truth of the bond. Her life, previously a quiet stream, had just become a raging river, irreversibly tied to the powerful Alpha King. Chapter 5. The Hunter's Fury. Despite the king's authoritative declaration, the court was still a cauldron of dangerous, simmering intrigue. The confirmed bond only made Aelia a bigger, more urgent target for those seeking to dismantle Alastair's rule. She understood the severity of her new status, because the history books whispered of assassinated Lunas and poisoned bloodlines. Seeking a moment of quiet, a desperate desire to simply breathe untainted air, she slipped away from the suffocating grandeur of the castle. She needed the grounding earth, the familiar silence of the forest, hoping the pack instinct she developed while healing wolves would offer some measure of protection. She was so wrong. The forest surrounding the black basalt palace wasn't the quiet sanctuary of her home. It was a dangerous, living entity. The moment she was 30 paces from the palace guards, the shift happened. She heard the snap of a twig, too sharp, too deliberate. The air thickened with a musky scent of strange hostile wolves, not Alastair's pack, but assassins, moving with terrifying silent precision. Furthermore, one of them detached from the shadows, a huge scarred grey brute, and launched himself at her. Terror, a cold, sharp blade, cut through her logic. Her survival instinct, honed by years of managing injuries and avoiding conflicts, kicked in not as a fight, but as an evasion. She scrambled backward, tripping over a gnarled root. Just as the grey wolf was about to tear into her, a sound of unimaginable fury ripped through the woods, the deep resonant snarl of a dominant alpha, a sound that felt less heard and more felt in the very marrow of her bones. A blur of midnight black, massive and deadly, slammed into the assassin. It was Alastair's wolf, a creature of mythic size and brutal grace. The ensuing struggle was a whirlwind of snapping teeth and tearing muscle, a terrifying, beautiful dance of death. Because the curse that supposedly shackled him was temporarily broken by the necessity of protecting his mate, his transformation was agonizingly quick, a spectacular, shattering process that showed his protective side. He was not cursed now. He was pure, desperate fury. As the black wolf stood over the defeated assassins, panting, eyes still burning with predatory gold, Aelia realized two truths simultaneously. She was not replaceable, she was the king's mate. Yet, the fear, the deep-seated self-doubt, made her resist the profound, undeniable claim of the bond. Chapter 6. The Point of No Return. Following the brutal, shocking ambush, Alastair carried her back to the fortress. He held her against his chest, her fear slowly dissipating into the warmth of his protective strength, though a sliver of terrifying uncertainty remained. The blood of the defeated assassins was a stark, red declaration across the forest floor. He settled her in his personal chambers, a place of severe, dark luxury, and summoned his beta, a formidable woman named Lyra, to guard the door. The high-stakes conflict had now irrevocably altered their dynamic. Aelia was no longer just a political pawn. She was a life-and-death liability, a living target. Alastair paced the room, his movements tight with restrained violence. "You will not leave this wing again," he ordered, his voice raw. They were waiting. They knew. Someone here betrayed me. His admission of internal weakness was a small, unexpected vulnerability that softened the sharp edges of his authority. Aelia approached him, her hand hesitant. "You saved me. Your wolf. It broke the curse," she whispered, the memory of his massive, powerful form burning bright. "But I cannot stay here simply as a hostage. I won't." She needed purpose. She needed to contribute. This was her decision point. Staying meant accepting the danger and the bond. To accept the bond meant embracing the terrifying possibility of finally being worthy of love, a risk greater than any assassin's knife. "You are entangled with me now, Aelia," he stated, his gaze piercing. "This goes beyond politics. It's destiny. It's the bond." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing the sensitive skin below her eye. He used this gentle touch to emphasize his claim. A silent, powerful question hung in the air. "Can you feel it?" The fierce, possessive need radiating off him was almost overwhelming. A blend of desire and terrifying responsibility. Because she felt the magnetic pull, the undeniable rightness of his touch, she could no longer pretend this was her sister's journey. Her new immediate goal formed, sharp and clear. She would navigate this treacherous palace life, she would survive the danger, and she would either accept or resist this fate, but she would not simply wait to collapse under the pressure. The world outside the chamber doors, a world filled with unknown enemies and a terrifying, unavoidable future, was waiting. Chapter 7. The Grand Facade. The days following the ambush were a blur of enforced stillness and oppressive politeness. The king's personal chambers, now her gilded cage, provided a strange contrast to the venomous atmosphere of the court. Nevertheless, Alastair insisted she attend the formal events, a necessary public display to solidify the bond's legitimacy and quell the escalating rumors. The great hall during the evening reception was blindingly bright, filled with the loud, cloying perfumes of rival alphas and the sharp metallic undercurrent of ambition. She felt the scrutiny of 100 eyes, each glance a physical jab, because she was the girl who had usurped the expected queen and survived an attempt on her life. She moved through the opulent crowd like a ship navigating a rocky shore, trying desperately to recall the social maneuvers Serene had mastered. However, the other royals and their consorts treated her with blatant, icy disdain. They snubbed her, turning their backs mid-conversation or dismissing her questions about pack affairs with patronizing smiles. Aelia understood the court politics immediately. She was viewed as a weak link, a temporary convenience. This fueled her anxiety, yet also sparked a cold, defiant determination. She wouldn't break. Moreover, she knew that in this world, proving her worth wasn't about surviving assassins. It was about surviving social isolation. She was perpetually on edge, her sense of invisibility warring with the terrifying visibility of her new status. She kept catching subtle glances from Alastair across the vast room, glances that were not judging, but watching, filled with a tension she couldn't decipher. The unspoken attraction between them, a taut wire stretched between two mountains, grew exponentially with every public obstacle she faced. Could he see past the spare to the woman inside? Chapter 8. The Shadow of Regret. Following one particularly brutal evening of social warfare, Aelia retreated to the palace library, seeking solace in the scent of old parchment and dust. The quiet was a necessary balm. She was immersed in reading forgotten treaties when the heavy door swung open, revealing Alastair. He wasn't in his formal regalia. He wore only a simple tunic, his shoulders broad and slightly slumped. He looked exhausted, the weight of the crown suddenly visible on his powerful frame. Because she had always focused on his terrifying power, seeing this subtle weariness was like catching a glimpse of a hidden landscape. He wasn't there to command. He was seeking quiet too. He noticed her studying a scroll detailing an ancient grievance with a neighboring Alpha, the same rival who had kidnapped her ally in the previous ambush. Before she could react, his hand shot out, intercepting a goblet of wine left carelessly on a table beside her. A low, guttural warning vibrated in his chest. "Don't touch it," he rasped, his eyes scanning the room, momentarily betraying an acute vulnerability that chilled her. This court is less predictable than the battlefield. He had assumed the small threat was aimed at her, demonstrating a reflexive, non-negotiable protective instinct. Consequently, Aelia's fear of him began to erode, replaced by confusion and a burgeoning awe. She saw not the king of legend, but a deeply isolated male struggling under the relentless burden of perpetual danger. "Who would try to poison me at a celebration meant for you?" she whispered, stepping closer, drawn by the profound loneliness she sensed in him. The unspoken attraction intensified, morphing into a perilous closeness, an early intimacy born not of shared laughter but shared peril. She wanted to reach out, to reassure him that he wasn't alone, to almost admit the powerful confusing feeling she held for him, but the moment was violently interrupted. A page rushed in, breathless, delivering an urgent, secretive message. Rival Alpha Lord Kaelin had deployed troops along the western border. The emotional spark was extinguished instantly by the cold shadow of political intrigue. Chapter 9. The First Stand. In the wake of Lord Kaelin's aggressive maneuver, the tension in the palace became a physical presence, a hum of anxiety that never ceased. Aelia, determined not to be the powerless liability she once feared, started looking for opportunities to contribute using the skills she did possess: her empathy and understanding of the pack's lower ranks. The opportunity arose during a council meeting addressing food rationing. An elderly, minor pack elder, clearly terrified, spoke up, begging for fairer distribution for the elderly and young. He was immediately silenced and harshly ridiculed by one of Alastair's high-ranking generals, who called the elder soft and inefficient. Alastair remained silent, testing the room. This was Aelia's first test of courage. She stepped forward, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her voice was surprisingly steady. "General," she began, pulling on a lesson learned from years of tending injuries. Gentle pressure applied exactly where it's needed. The stability of a pack isn't measured solely by its military might, but by its capacity to protect its weakest members. To dismiss his plea as inefficiency is to ignore the source of our loyalty. To defend the weaker wolf meant risking humiliation and the general's wrath, but the desire to finally matter outweighed her fear. She met the general's furious gaze without flinching. Alastair, for the first time, smiled, a slight, dangerous curve of his lips that signaled approval. Her small act of public decency and logical defense earned her the small respect of the neutral observers and caused a crucial, internal growth spurt. She realized her strength wasn't the sword, but her unwavering moral compass. This pivotal moment established her authority not through marriage, but through action. The stakes, though minor in terms of war, were major in terms of her arc. As the meeting concluded, she saw the general immediately slip away, exchanging a dark, conspiratorial glance with a member of Kaelin's envoy. The court intrigue wasn't just escalating, it was actively plotting against her. Her defense of the elder was noted, but so was her weakness. This small victory only guaranteed that a greater, more complicated threat was quickly approaching. Chapter 10. The Secret Allies. The recent clash in the council room, where she defended the pack elder, had subtly shifted the ground beneath her feet. She was no longer just the king's fiancée. She was a variable. Because she was determined to prove her competence, she knew relying solely on Alastair's protection was not sustainable. Her fear of being discarded had crystallized into a fervent drive for independence. She began holding secret meetings in the quiet morning hours, utilizing the palace's extensive, labyrinthine tunnels she discovered while mapping out hidden escape routes. Her allies were few: the beta, Lyra, who respected action over birthright, and the elderly pack elder she had defended. "The king's defenses are strong, but his circle is too small," she explained to Lyra, her voice low and urgent as they walked through a cold, forgotten cellar. "We need to gain influence outside the central court. We must know who supports Lord Kaelin before the attack comes." Conversely, Alastair noticed her increased restlessness, the late hours, and the sudden air of preoccupation. He cornered her in the training yard, his massive form blocking the setting sun. "You are moving in the shadows, Aelia," he stated, his voice a gravelly warning. "This is my war. You are putting yourself at greater risk than you comprehend." His warning was laced with fear, exposing the pressure building on him to keep her safe while managing the war. "I am trying to learn to survive," she retorted, the defiance in her heart overwhelming the fear of his authority. "I refuse to be a prisoner waiting for rescue. Trust me, Alastair." This internal conflict between her need for self-determination and his protective reliance was a tension stretching their tentative relationship thin. The pressure builds, creating a sense of urgency. Just as she thought she had gained his reluctant trust, a message arrived, delivered by a frantic, bloodied messenger. Lord Kaelin had kidnapped Lyra's younger brother, a key figure in the Western defenses. The message explicitly stated the boy would be executed unless Aelia, the false queen, met Kaelin at the abandoned border tower alone. The threat was now direct and deeply personal. Chapter 11. The Bloodline's Price. Following the appalling escalation by Lord Kaelin, the panic in the palace was palpable, but in Aelia, fear was suddenly replaced by a cold, burning clarity. She knew she could not sacrifice Lyra's innocent brother. While searching the ancient documents in the palace library for any legal loophole regarding Kaelin's claims, she stumbled upon a dust-covered tome detailing the history of the Alpha King bloodline, a history that contained a terrifying secret. The immediate goal was finding a solution, but she unearthed a midpoint revelation instead. The pages described the ancient curse that plagued Alastair, a magical shackle limiting his transformation and control, cast by a rival which centuries ago. But the antidote, the text explained, lay not in magic, but in blood. She learned her bloodline holds the key to breaking Alastair's curse. Specifically, the rare, dormant lunar energy passed through the second-born daughters of her house, known for their healing and sacrifice. Shock, disbelief, and a terrifying sense of responsibility coursed through her. Because this knowledge reframed her worthiness from an emotional question to a critical, potentially lethal destiny, the stakes became infinitely personal. She wasn't just his mate. She was his only salvation, and the enemy knew it. Alastair found her, staring white-faced at the text, the heavy book open to the fatal chapter. His reaction was a terrifying mixture of protective rage and internal conflict. He seized the book, slamming it shut. "You will never speak of this," he commanded, his eyes blazing gold, fear warring with desire. "I will not risk your life for my freedom." The revelation sparked a heated argument, a clash of wills where romantic tension and desperation were fused together. "You would rather be cursed than live?" she challenged, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. Conversely, he pulled her against him, crushing her to his chest. "I would rather live cursed than lose you because of me." His grip was almost painful, a physical manifestation of his struggle between prophecy and protection. The silent, desperate plea hanging in the air made the bond between them momentarily snap. A sharp, cold break, before the sheer force of his love and fear pulled it taut again. Chapter 12. The Reckoning of Trust. In the immediate aftermath of the argument, the palace plunged into a state of high alert. Kaelin's aggressive actions were a clear declaration of war, fueled by his desperate desire to possess the power of Aelia's bloodline, a power he wrongly believed was held by the firstborn daughter. The palace guards moved like ghosts, their movements tense and silent. Aelia, still reeling from the twin shock of the curse revelation and Alastair's raw, desperate declaration of love, understood she was the epicenter of the storm. Her new, immediate goal was to protect Lyra's brother, and terrifyingly, to reconcile the overwhelming feelings she held for Alastair with his stubborn refusal to let her fight for him. She sought out Lyra, who was pale with fear for her brother, yet fiercely loyal. "Kaelin's threat isn't just political, Lyra. He wants my blood," Aelia admitted, the honesty difficult. "We need a plan that saves your brother and forces Alastair to trust me." To formulate a plan that defied the king was an act of profound defiance and rising confidence. The relationship tension peaked. Alastair, burdened by the weight of prophecy and his own fear of losing her, had become withdrawn and overly authoritative, treating her like precious, fragile cargo. How could he truly love her if he wouldn't trust her strength? While Aelia was secretly making preparations for a solo rendezvous at the border tower, a desperate gambit to buy time, Alastair, his face a mask of stone, intercepted her. He struggled with prophecy and trust, and the struggle was visible in the tremor in his hands. He gripped her arm, not in anger, but in sheer terror. "No," he growled, the word heavy with finality. Because he had been warned that any action to save him from the curse would put the second-born daughter's life in immediate peril, his rejection of her help felt like a betrayal. The confrontation raised the urgency to a fever pitch, leading to a devastating silent truth. She realized she could not wait for his permission to save the pack or him. Her decision was made. She had to move, even if it meant risking a final permanent break with the man she was falling in love with. The confrontation had solidified her path. She was going to the tower. This leads directly to the point of no return. Chapter 13. The Defiant Sacrifice. The cool metallic taste of defiance was bracing, a stark contrast to the stifling air of the palace. Aelia knew what she had to do, even though it meant actively defying the man whose gold eyes now haunted her dreams. Her preparation was meticulous, a silent protest against the expectations of fragility. Because Alastair's overprotection stemmed from the curse's prophecy, a threat she now fully understood, she realized the only way to save him was to embrace the very danger he feared. She slipped away before dawn, carrying nothing but her wits and the small worn leather pouch her father had given her, the forgotten secret now feeling like a heavy anchor of fate. She left a short note for Lyra, explaining her intention to meet Kaelin at the abandoned border tower, a calculated risk to draw the villain away from the palace and force the enemy's hand. To commit to her path meant transforming immediately from the insecure spare into a decisive, purposeful player. The thought of Alastair's reaction, his fury, his despair, was a knife twist, but her determination was stronger. Survival wasn't passive. It was an action. She reached the borderlands, the ancient stone tower looming like a skeletal finger against the fading moonlight. She waited, heart hammering a drumbeat against her ribs, the terrifying reality of her solitary mission washing over her. Lord Kaelin arrived not alone, but with 2 menacing guards and a triumphant smirk that spoke of inevitable victory. "The wrong sister but the right blood," he purred, eyeing her with contempt and unsettling desire. His tone emphasized his belief that Aelia was a necessary tool, not a worthy queen. She realized then that Kaelin believed the lunar bloodline was necessary for his own power grab, a key piece of information she could exploit. Conversely, his blatant arrogance gave her an opening. She had committed to her course, and the adrenaline now tasted like raw power. She had reached her point of no return. Chapter 14. The Exposed Vulnerability. Following the chilling confrontation with Lord Kaelin, Aelia was forced to act on her knowledge, betting everything on the assumption that her bloodline was key, even if the prophecy remained vague. She used the chaos of a staged skirmish, orchestrated by Lyra's loyalists in the nearby woods, as cover. She saved Lyra's brother, pulling him from Kaelin's grasp and sending him running back toward the palace line, but in the ensuing confusion, she exposed herself to direct danger. Kaelin, enraged by the loss of his leverage, seized her, his grip bruising. "The girl of sacrifice," Kaelin hissed into her ear, dragging her deeper into the thicket, away from the skirmish. "Your king abandons you because he fears his own darkness." He intended to use her not just as a tool, but as a public execution, a definitive end to Alastair's reign. However, the danger she courted had an immediate, profound effect on the mate bond. The terror and pain she experienced sent a desperate, psychic shockwave back to the palace, a connection stronger than any curse. Alastair appeared, a terrifying vision of unleashed fury, tearing through the trees like a force of nature. His transformation was incomplete. Jagged, dark fur was visible beneath his torn clothes, a testament to the curse still battling his rage, but his speed was unmatched. Kaelin threw Aelia aside, forcing Alastair into a desperate, messy fight. Aelia watched them, breathless, feeling the intensity of the fight resonate through her body. Alastair, burdened by the curse, was fighting dirty, his every movement a struggle against a force that threatened to consume him. Her feelings for him, a searing mix of growing desire and fearful adoration, were overwhelming. He was risking everything, not for his crown, but for her. The bond intensified, pulling them together even as their bodies were violently separated. She knew now. Her destiny was intertwined with his curse, and this moment was leading them toward a terrifying climax. Chapter 15. The Final Shadow. In the desperate moments following Kaelin's brutal ambush, Aelia witnessed the king's sacrifice firsthand. He fought with the savagery of a cornered beast, driven by a primal need to protect his mate, despite the agonizing constraint of the curse. This experience cemented her acceptance of the bond. It wasn't a political arrangement, but a life-or-death commitment. She was watching her future, bloodied and struggling, fight for her existence. She accepted the terrifying truth. She loved him. However, Kaelin, seeing Alastair weakened by his internal struggle, pulled a hidden blade, silver, forged to paralyze shifters. He moved swiftly, catching Alastair in the flank, delivering a critical paralyzing blow. Alastair roared, a sound of agony and helplessness, crashing to the ground. Kaelin now stood over Aelia, triumphant, his shadow covering her. The king is broken. The prophecy is mine. He grasped her arm, his intention clear. Abduction. The feeling of his cold possessive touch was a horrifying violation, a crushing blow to her emerging sense of self-worth. A wave of crushing despair washed over her, yet something deep inside refused to submit. She was embracing courage, a steel spine replacing her former fear. The mate bond, now fully engaged through trauma, screamed with both terror and fierce loyalty. This critical juncture meant no turning back. The destiny she had initially resisted was now fully in play. She was captured, the palace was alerted to a severely wounded king, and Kaelin was pulling her away toward his stronghold. Where was the key? Where was the antidote? She stared at the sliver of silver embedded in Alastair's side, realizing the prophecy was no longer a shadow, but a devastating immediate reality. The stage was set for the darkest moment of the story, the descent. Chapter 16. The Usurper's Claim. The journey to Lord Kaelin's distant, heavily fortified fortress was a blur of rough travel and psychological cruelty. The scent of pine and dirt gave way to the sharp, bitter smell of stone and desperation. Upon arrival at his dark domain, Aelia was thrown into a cold, isolated cell, the stone walls amplifying her terror. She was forced to endure Kaelin's presence, his smug, predatory eyes and the chilling certainty in his voice. Your king is defeated, broken by silver, and restrained by his own bloodline curse. You are mine now, little healer, he claimed, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. This was the major blow, not just her capture, but the agonizing knowledge that Alastair, the powerful king, was paralyzed and helpless, his primal curse achieving what Kaelin's armies could not. Aelia sank onto the cold floor, panicking a tight knot in her chest. The mate bond, usually a warm constant pulse, was now a thread of excruciating pain and distance. She questioned her self-worth. Did I lead him to this? Was I too arrogant in my defiance? Her fear and trauma surfaced, threatening to overwhelm the courage she had just found. Because Kaelin claimed her so easily, the old wounds of feeling replaceable reopened, twisting the fear of failure into a crushing helplessness. A small story or scenario to create emotional investment. She remembered a childhood memory of Serene casually destroying Aelia's favorite handmade wooden wolf carving, claiming Aelia could just make a better one. The feeling of being easily replaced, easily broken, was back. Kaelin, perceiving her silence as submission, returned later, his demeanor less cruel and more calculating. He presented her with an unsettling truth. He had allies within Alastair's inner circle, not merely external rivals. He subtly revealed his connection to a dark, ancient prophecy. A prophecy that threatened not just Alastair's life, but the very stability of the shifter world. The sudden exposure to this grand terrifying scheme, a dark secret within the palace, forced internal reflection and heightened her terror. The open loop of the family secret felt heavy in her pocket, a constant reminder of the key she had yet to understand. Could a simple pouch truly defeat this level of organized, ancient treachery? Chapter 17. The Echoes of Betrayal. Following the usurper's revelation of his dark ties, Aelia sought desperately for hope, a sign that her secret allies were moving. She paced the freezing cell, rubbing her arms against the chill, focusing only on the distant painful hum of the bond, a fragile lifeline to Alastair. Instead of rescue, she received a visitor, a woman cloaked in shadow, brought by Kaelin as a horrifying trophy. The cloak dropped, and Aelia's breath caught in her throat. It was Serene. The loss and betrayal were absolute. Serene, her eyes glittering with cold hard resentment, was not a prisoner. She was Kaelin's accomplice. "Did you truly believe you belonged on that throne, little sister?" Serene sneered, her voice devoid of warmth. "You took my destiny, and now you pay the price for your arrogance. Kaelin will reward me." Aelia felt utterly abandoned, the despair a cold, deep wave. The revelation was the lowest emotional point, a shattering blow that went deeper than Kaelin's threats. Serene's long-held jealousy and sense of entitlement were the true source of the betrayal, and because it came from her own blood, it was infinitely more devastating than any outside attack. Was she truly so easily betrayed by those she loved? Kaelin delighted in her pain, emphasizing the failure of her support structure. "Your king is dying. Your allies are neutralized. Your own blood turns against you." This trauma highlighted her need for self-trust, forcing her to confront the deepest, most corrosive fear of her life. Am I truly replaceable? A cruel silence settled after Serene departed, leaving Aelia alone with the crushing realization that her attempt at selfless duty had only resulted in disaster and betrayal. The pain of the mate bond spiked, a reflection of Alastair's own fading life force, confirming the danger was not just political, but terminal. The crucible moment was at hand. Chapter 18. The King's Final Push. Despite the crushing reality of Serene's betrayal and Alastair's failing strength, Aelia refused to succumb entirely to hopelessness. She was broken, yes, but not defeated. She felt the mate bond flicker, a final desperate burst of energy emanating from Alastair before it began to fade entirely. She understood the message instantly, transmitted psychically through the bond's last remaining flicker. He was deliberately rejecting her to protect her from the curse's prophecy. He believed the only way to save her life was to completely sever their spiritual connection, cutting her loose before the curse could drag her down with him. The feeling of being alone and rejected in that bleak cell was a searing agony, 1,000 times worse than physical pain. He didn't trust her to survive the fire. She sank against the cold stone, reflecting on her entire life, her worthiness, and the twisted destiny that had brought her here. "You are not replaceable," she whispered to the empty room, repeating the words like a desperate, necessary mantra. The seeds of transformation were finally planted in this desperate isolation. She realized that seeking external validation, from her father, from the pack, from Alastair's love, was the very thing that had made her vulnerable. She finally pulled out the worn leather pouch from her pocket. The fear that it might be useless was immense, but she opened it anyway. Inside, nestled on soft, dark velvet, was a small, perfectly carved piece of moonstone, glowing faintly with an inner ethereal blue light. The stone of the second-born. A memory of her grandmother, the old pack healer, surfaced, a story about the true purpose of the lunar healers. The moonstone was not an antidote. It was a catalyst for a primal energy transfer capable of overloading ancient curses. This was the key. She wasn't meant to save him with medicine. She was meant to save him with power. A fierce, determined energy, cold and hard as the stone she held, flooded her. She prepares for the final push, a desperate, reckless plan to rescue herself and reclaim her love, acknowledging the ultimate truth. Her destiny was solely her own to claim. Chapter 19. The Moonstone's Command. The tiny glowing moonstone in her palm felt less like a relic and more like a captured piece of the night sky, radiating a cold, resolute power that steadied the frantic drumming of her heart. Following the king's final act of protective rejection, Aelia found a clarity sharper than any diamond. She was alone, isolated, and utterly determined. She finally uncovered the full truth of her bloodline and fate, realizing the purpose of the second-born daughters was not merely passive healing, but wielding and controlling raw lunar energy to enforce cosmic balance. The power to break the curse wasn't in her blood. It was in her inherent command over the ritual. She pressed the moonstone against her skin, feeling a surge of icy energy, a direct link to the ancient forgotten strength of her ancestors. She accepted the mate bond completely, not as a weakness, but as the channel through which her new power must flow. The fear of being the insecure spare was obliterated, replaced by the certainty of a powerful, empowered destiny. To gain full control of the power, she had to fully accept the love she was fighting for. She was now determined, empowered, embracing courage, The transformation was complete, the fearful girl shed like old skin. Kaelin's guard eventually arrived to drag her to the main hall for a forced public declaration. The confrontation created urgency, as she knew this was her only chance. As the guard approached, Aelia didn't fight with brute force. She used the stone, channeling the cold lunar energy, creating a sharp blinding burst of blue light that momentarily stunned him. The force of the sudden energy burst sent the guard reeling back against the stone wall. She was free of the cell, but deep within enemy territory. The next step was finding her allies and formulating a final, desperate strategy. Chapter 20. The Unseen Strategy. Utilizing the sudden and unexpected advantage of the lunar burst, Aelia moved through Kaelin's fortress like a ghost, relying on the primal scent of the stone to guide her past the guards. Her only known allies were Alastair's beta, Lyra, and her loyalists, who were supposedly neutralized. Conversely, Aelia found a hidden signal carved into the corner of the courtyard wall. A tiny, stylized wolf paw, a sign that Lyra was closer than Kaelin believed. This discovery was an unexpected plot twist that infused her with renewed purpose. She met Lyra in the cold, damp shadows of the armory, the beta's face etched with worry and relief. Lyra confirmed that Alastair, though gravely wounded and paralyzed, was still alive, confined in the fortress dungeons, a tactical error by Kaelin who wanted the king to witness his own defeat. Kaelin plans to force the ceremony at dawn to claim your bloodline power as his own, Lyra whispered, her breath steaming in the cold air. Aelia, focused and brave, laid out her counter-strategy, using the moonstone as the central piece. We won't stop the ceremony. We'll use it. I will channel the moonstone's power through the mate bond to break the curse, not just heal him. It will be a weapon. Because Lyra was a formidable warrior who understood the power of sacrifice, she immediately grasped the immense risk and the potential reward of the plan. They quickly aligned themselves with the few loyal pack members Lyra had managed to sneak in. The plan was audacious, relying entirely on Aelia's ability to control a nascent, primal power while under duress. The stakes were highest yet. If Aelia failed, she would die, Alastair would die, and Kaelin would rule the shifter world with an unchallenged corrupted power. The stage was now perfectly set for the ultimate showdown. Chapter 21. Infiltration and Fire. Following the secret strategy session in the shadows, Aelia and Lyra moved with the silent predatory efficiency of highly trained wolves. The execution began under the cover of the midnight gloom, the atmosphere thick with the smell of metal, cold stone, and anticipated bloodshed. Lyra led a small, fierce contingent of loyalists to secure the dungeon entrance, creating a crucial diversionary attack. Aelia, carrying the moonstone wrapped in a scrap of dark cloth, moved toward the main ceremony hall. The air in the long dark corridors was charged with suspense, every shadow a potential assassin. She reached the door leading to the dungeons, her heart a heavy, relentless drum. She was focused, brave, and emotionally ready to risk everything for the man who had fought for her life. As she slipped past the last guard, she saw Alastair. He was chained to a heavy stone pillar, his body slack and unnaturally pale, the silver wound still weeping on his flank. He was barely breathing. The sight of him, wounded and vulnerable, broke her heart yet fueled her resolve, a profound mix of courageous love and fierce determination that transcended pain. She rushed to his side, her touch eliciting a weak, agonizing moan. "I'm here, my king. I accept," she whispered, her hands already reaching for the silver blade embedded in his side. She knew removing it would accelerate his death or trigger the final fatal wave of the curse. But she had to. She had to release the pressure to channel the power. The danger and romantic tension spiked to an unbearable peak. As she prepared the moonstone, the sound of Kaelin's main force arriving above them boomed through the stone floor. He was coming. Aelia pulled the silver out in one swift, agonizing motion, setting the stage for the climactic confrontation just moments away. Chapter 22. The Primal Claim. The moment Aelia ripped the silver blade from Alastair's side, a searing white-hot pain shot through the mate bond, confirming the lethal gamble she had taken. The blood loss was immediate and terrifying, but the rush of energy from the moonstone demanded she move faster than fear. Lord Kaelin burst into the dungeon, a triumphant sneer contorting his face, his guards flooding the chamber. "Too late, little sacrifice. The king dies now." he roared, lunging toward the chained Alpha. The final showdown was upon them. Aelia ignored Kaelin, focusing solely on Alastair, pressing the glowing moonstone against the wound. Simultaneously, she channeled the raw, potent lunar energy through the newly amplified mate bond, not as a trickle, but as a violent, overwhelming torrent. "I choose you! Live!" she screamed, pouring every ounce of her accepted destiny and love into him. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. The chamber filled with blinding blue light, and Alastair's curse, unable to withstand the overwhelming primal energy, shattered like glass. He roared, a sound that was half agony, half ultimate primal assertiveness, tearing his massive body free from the chains. Alastair's fully transformed wolf, midnight black, colossal, and completely unchained, slammed into Kaelin. The fight was short, brutal, and definitive. The rival Alpha was defeated in a terrifying display of raw, pure Alpha power. Kaelin's scream was cut short as Alastair asserted his dominance. However, the energy transfer had been too much. The king, free but exhausted, stumbled, nearly collapsing. Aelia rushed forward, catching him as his great form began to phase back into his human shape. Alastair nearly died, but her final act of asserting her love and worth had broken the cycle. The conflict resolved, the mate bond was fully realized, and Aelia proved herself not only worthy, but essential. Chapter 23. The Dawn of Healing. Following the devastating climax and the king's brutal necessary transformation, the dungeon air was thick with smoke, victory, and the faint, sweet scent of newly stabilized shifter energy. Alastair, weak and pale but conscious, was immediately moved to his private, secure chambers, surrounded by Lyra and Aelia. The atmosphere was one of immediate relief and quiet joy, settling the immediate threats. Aelia worked ceaselessly, her hands moving with the practiced grace of the pack healer she once was, though now empowered by the lunar stone. She tended his wounds, the physical healing aided by the sudden powerful flow of their shared life force through the bond. News of Kaelin's defeat and the king's survival spread like wildfire. Consequently, the palace, which had been paralyzed by doubt, began to acknowledge Aelia's rightful role. Messengers and nobles, previously disdainful, now bowed with genuine reverence. They saw the scars she bore and the king's unyielding gaze. A small private moment solidified their romance confirmation. Alastair, his eyes clear and devoid of the curse's shadow, reached for her hand, his touch strong and unburdened. "You saved me. You are my queen, Aelia. Not by proxy, but by your own ferocious choice," he murmured, his voice husky with love and gratitude. His simple declaration resolved the immediate threats and set up long-term peace. He gave her a small knowing smile, a promise of shared dominion. A relevant scenario creating emotional investment. Aelia remembered her sister Serene's cruel dismissal of her healing efforts. Now, her healing hands had not only saved the king's life but redeemed her own. This realization resolved her inner guilt about taking her sister's place. She hadn't taken anything. She had earned this destiny through courage. Chapter 24. The Queen Claimed. Upon the final settlement of the political and physical turmoil, the ancient black basalt palace prepared for an event unlike any in its history. A coronation that was also a mate-claiming ceremony. The atmosphere was hopeful, emotionally satisfying, and deeply profound. Aelia stood before the court, no longer wearing her sister's oversized gown, but a simple, perfectly fitted dress of deep crimson, symbolizing both her sacrifice and her fierce spirit. The shift in her posture was undeniable. The insecurity was gone, replaced by a quiet, absolute confidence and self-worth. Alastair, fully recovered and radiating raw, unchained alpha energy, stood beside her. He looked at her not with gratitude, but with absolute possession and adoration. The impact of the transformation was complete. The insecure, invisible girl had become the powerful, confident queen and mate. In a ceremony blending ancient tradition with their own fierce love, he placed the heavy silver crown upon her head, not as a gift, but as a mutual agreement. He pulled her close, his eyes blazing, and performed the epic mate-claiming moment before the entire court. A deep, sensual kiss that sealed their bond and declared their union absolute. "You are mine, Aelia," he growled, the word heavy with both possession and devotion, loud enough for every whisperer and rival to hear. And I am yours. The transformation from fearful spare to powerful queen was sealed. Her destiny fully realized through her courage and love. The moonstone, now embedded in the base of her crown, pulsed with a calm, steady light, a testament to her unique power. This final scene left a powerful impression of hope and ultimate fulfillment, confirming that those who believe they are unworthy can indeed be fiercely chosen, and more importantly, can fight for the love they deserve. The future was now theirs, shared and powerful.